So today's presenter, we have Dr. Barbara Fair. She is an associate professor in the Department of Horticultural Science and a landscape specialist for North Carolina. She provides expertise to extension faculty across the state, as well as the green industry, focusing extensively on issues of landscape sustainability and arboriculture. In addition, Barbara teaches landscape ecosystem management and green infrastructure, the functional use of plants in the urban landscapes at NC State. She is a certified arborist with extensive arboriculture and urban forestry background. She earned her bachelor's and master's degree from Penn State University and her PhD from Ohio State University. With that, Barbara, I will let you go ahead and get started.
Great, thank you. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep, you are good to go.
All right, awesome. So we'll get started. So today I kind of want to talk about how amazing plants are in a way, as well as talk about how we kind of can prepare them for some of the inevitable storms that we're going to have here in North Carolina. I did choose to focus mostly on flooding because this is certainly something that we have had many issues with in the past few years. I'll address a couple of other issues as well with why we're having so many trees dying in the past couple of years. I think it's not just flooding, but a few other abiotic issues that plants face. So you guys might know these plants. These are bristlecone pine out west, and you think about how long these plants have lived. They're thousands of years old. I think the oldest one is over 5,000 years old. And you picture how they're growing and what they're growing in. It's pretty amazing. And the cool part about this plant is that it allows part of itself to actually die back in order to save the whole. And so that's, I think, a pretty neat mechanism to survive for really long periods of time. So just a cool thing. And we know plants can survive in just about no soil. This is the witch tree in Minnesota. I've had the opportunity to actually see there and live up there for a little while. It is freaking cold up there. And you think about this tree growing straight out of the rocks. This one's not quite as old as the bristlecone pine. It's only about 300 years old. But you know how they say it ain't easy for a weed to grow? Well, we know that's not really true. It's quite easy for those weeds to grow. Baobab trees and Joshua trees, just picturing the kind of difficult environments that these trees actually live in. So we all have all these tables and charts and maps and such about how our climate is changing. And one of the things we certainly focus on is temperature. And this just shows you kind of an image of how we expect some of the predictions on how we expect temperature to change in the next maybe 50 to 100 years. And one of the biggest issues is that a lot of the heat trapping gases are actually being reduced because of climate change. And so obviously that means we're going to have a lot more heat trapped in our environment. So hurricanes are certainly an inevitable part of living in North Carolina, particularly along the coast and into the Piedmont, certainly. And I think even in other parts of the state, you can certainly have flooding issues. So that's kind of why I chose to focus particularly on this subject. We think about how the sea temperatures are changing as well. You think about how much of an increase those are having, plus an increase in wind speeds. And when you think about those increase in precipitation rates, then you also think about how the sea levels will be rising over the next century. They're talking about 1 to 4 feet. So that is really quite significant when you start thinking about how that's going to affect our coastal regions, and I guess what will be our coastal regions in the future. You think about storm surge and certainly an increase then in potential damage, not only between the high water, the high waves, but those winds as well, blowing some of that water in further into our coastal areas. So how do trees actually die? I thought it would be important for us to kind of talk about what is the plant's response when we have these really wet, inundated conditions. And so if you imagine, there are not only acute changes to that environment, that soil and tree relationship, but then there are also these longer term chronic problems that we'll talk about a little bit more. But certainly one of the first things we think about is the movement of soil. So it's deposited in different places. And along with that sediment, there are certainly whatever chemicals might be on the roadways or on our hardscapes that end up in the soil and then end up affecting the health of the trees in the long term. And it's certainly obvious that trees can be easily easily knocked over due to that loss of that intimate contact with the soil and the roots, as well as extremely high winds in those situations. So I want to talk to you get in a little bit more science and chemistry here about what actually happens. So oxygen is actually an electron acceptor. Okay, so that's really important in what happens in everything in a plant as well as in animals. When you think about anaerobic and aerobic conditions, anaerobic implies there's no oxygen, and that's when there's not enough oxygen, something else has to act as an electron receptor in those cases. And so what ends up happening is things like manganese and iron become kind of soluble in the soil and then can lead to toxicity problems. And over time, if the cell's having kind of trouble transferring those electrons to the environment because of those high levels of things other than oxygen, then inside the tree and outside the tree kind of become the same. And so what happens is sulfur then becomes the next electron acceptor. And I know as soon as I said sulfur, you guys are thinking stinky stuff, right? Well, that's essentially what happens, because as sulfur becomes that electron acceptor instead of oxygen, then there's a chance for hydrogen sulfide to be produced, which is incredibly toxic to tree roots. So those sulfides bond with a lot of different compounds in the soil, making things insoluble and then unusable to the plant in the long-term process. So when you think about without oxygen, you end up with this idea of fermentation, right? So now we know we've got all these stressed roots. The thing about fermentation is it transfers electrons to carbon. But fermentation takes about 20 times the amount of food reserves in order to produce the same amount of energy. So things are still sort of happening, but it costs the plant much, much more when that's happening. And then other things like hydrocarbons, alcohols, fatty acids, phenolic compounds, methane, CO2 gases, hydrogen and nitrogen gases are all kind of produced and escape as bubbles, right? They rise to the surface. But as that's happening, that is also toxic to roots and can be to the stems of plants, particularly some of those younger plants. So interesting, flood tolerant species, how do they work? Well, they have a lot of different methodologies to kind of expel or store some of those byproducts in small amounts. So it makes it a little bit easier for them. Doesn't mean that they're not going to be damaged by long-term flooding over time, and certainly under those fermentation conditions. Sorry, I just knocked my my headset off of my head. I'm very coordinated today. So essentially, under those fermentation conditions, the root cells use a lot of carbohydrates that have been stored. And once those are happening too, then that carbon, those root cells are now fair game for microbes to consume because they're looking for carbon as well. So this whole situation, when you start thinking about the intimate relationship between the roots and the soil and what's happening, you end up with this kind of electron-rich soup. And guess what? Because you got sulfur and you got fermentation, it's stinky and kind of slimy, and trees will not survive in the long term there. So I know that's a lot of crazy chemistry, but when really, if you have a chance, you kind of go and check it out and see really what I'm talking about there, because it really is important in thinking about how a tree loses those energy reserves. And so you think about very large trees, they lose energy reserves over a longer period of time. And so we'll see what it looks like, oh, this tree just died suddenly, and I'm sure your clients and some folks that you know will say, oh my gosh, my tree just up and died. Well, we know that's not really the case with these larger mature trees. And you can trace it back not only to Florence, I think, but to many storms before that. So we get that cycle of really hot, dry weather, then we get really wet conditions, then we get really hot, dry, and on and on and on. And that cycle stresses those plants over time. And I think what happens when we finally see the tree succumb, it's because it's kind of the last straw. It has no energy left in those cells to really grow or maintain itself, because trees have to use their energy for a lot of different things, as we know, reproduction and defense and growth and so forth. So So what happens in the soil is, of course, if you have a soil that lacks aggregation, it makes it a lot harder for those nutrients and water to kind of move through that soil system. And clay obviously is being dispersed with the water, and certainly now you're going to get leaching of really essential elements. And if we are losing soil from a site where we know we're losing things like phosphorus, because phosphorus is so tightly bound to those soil particles. So you will have organic matter broken down, but now it's broken down by anaerobic bacteria. And so it occurs about half the rate as it normally would. So now we're not having as many nutrients from the organic matter being added back into the soil system. So if you have nitrogen and sulfur lost, again, now you get that kind of sticky layer of partially decomposed organic matter. So some other things that happen in the tree, and kind of, what periods throughout the tree's life are they most susceptible? Well, certainly older trees may be more susceptible to some of these conditions, again, depending on what kind of environmental cycles we've seen over time. But just about every stage of the plant is affected, from when it's trying to germinate seeds through sprouting and trying to grow. And we find that those floods that occur during the growing season are actually much more damaging to plants than when they're dormant. And if you think about it, that kind of makes a lot of good sense. So if photosynthesis is shutting down, transpiration is slowing down as well. And that does take a little bit of time for those things to happen. So the plant is trying to adjust its transpiration losses. But if you have a dysfunctional root system, then the plant is not taking up water. So if it's not taking up water, what you find is the plant is actually super dry inside. And if some of you have read some of Ed Gilman's work, he's kind of offered up this alternative to coat it about how does decay get into a plant. And one of the ways that happens is a lack of water inside a plant. Plants are made up mostly of water. And so when you have a lack of water, actually there are certain fungal organisms that then begin to germinate during that time. So you can end up with decay inside a plant if you have a lack of water, because oxygen inside the plant is actually an issue if it's at certain levels, right? So what we find is the plant now can't move ions and everything around. Water has to move everything, so water is the key to the life of the plant. And if we have dysfunctional root systems, then we have a dysfunctional plant. So a couple of other things that kind of happen is there are certainly hormones and growth regulators that are helping the plant communicate back and forth. And if oxygen is affected, then that's not happening well inside the plant. And the concentrations of things like auxin and ethylene and ABA is really important hormone and that's produced mostly in the roots, a little bit in the leaves, but in the roots it signals the leaves to close the stomates or open them based on whether or not there's sufficient water available. So when these things are happening, those concentrations change, so you might see weird things kind of happening where you might get weird leaf growth, epinasty, or you might have senescence or abscission of leaves. And certainly we see that quite frequently as one of the primary initial responses. You can get leaf drop with even plants that are wetland tolerant or wetland species. What happens is those that are not very tolerant of flooded conditions, you might see leaf drop within a couple of weeks. With those that are wetland species, it might take a little bit longer, maybe 8 or more weeks, but it doesn't mean that those plants are not still potentially damaged from that. So it makes sense that the first symptoms that we might see are going to be yellowing and early fall coloring. I love this picture. This is a willow. Willows are pretty tough plants, right? In many cases, they fall apart easy, but I love that they form these adventitious roots, and you can see on the trunk and then on the edges of the branches, wherever those branches were touching the water, they were able to form adventitious roots. So that can be good for a kind of short-term survival, but that also means that they're using energy. And remember, because now we have a dysfunctional root system, there's leaking of nutrients, and you have this really wet system, now the plant has been set up for phytophthora or other root rot issues. But now it is also more prone to water stress in the future. So that's why I say these cycles of dry and hot and wet are really what is very hard for plants to adapt to. And if you have a suppression of mycorrhizal fungi, then you have lost that really nice association that helps with water uptake and extending the root system so it has a larger area. So we know certainly that what we see a lot of is siltation, sedimentation, and certainly erosion, where we end up with soil in different places than it once used to be. We obviously have outright tree failure, where plants fail. And if you think about the power of water, it is pretty incredible. Force is 3.5 times that of air. So it makes sense. And two, if you think again about how that there has now been a displacement of the relationship between the roots and the soil. So now it's a much easier for the plants to actually fail. So certainly I add this because this is an important factor to think about in how this is not caused by flooding, but I want you to think about if you have a root system that has actually been covered by sediment and flooding, then you can understand why you might have root decay and why you might have a tree that does fail. So one possible way after the storm is, can we go in and do some root collar excavations to save those trees that are really significant? And certainly that needs to happen pretty quickly. So let me talk just a little bit about the characteristics of the flood that we need. And as I mentioned earlier, it is those floods that happen during the growing season that tend to be worse. And that's because if you think about it, everything is still happening and the plant is growing during those warmer temperatures. So it's going to dehydrate very, very quickly, and a much more severe shortage of oxygen because things are still happening, but now they're happening in that anaerobic condition. So the plant has higher respiration needs, meaning it needs to try to function better than it has been. So, and now it has to potentially fight off the loss of some foliage. So the quality of the water is also important, because the more stagnant it is, the more damage you might potentially have to the tree. And if you think about that, makes sense with some of the chemistry I talked about earlier. What's happening outside in that rhizosphere is equally as important what's happening inside the roots, because they're so intimately related. So kind of in general, how do plants respond? So broadleaf trees are a little bit more tolerant than conifers, which makes sense, right? And so we include bald cypress in there because remember, that's a great bottomland species. That's where it grows, but it does quite well in some drier sites. As well. Although I have seen it recently used in some stormwater devices where a little bit too much sediment and confined root systems have been very challenging for those trees to perform well and get well established. It makes sense, you know, you middle-aged, they're a little bit more tolerant than younger or older, which is kind of cool because, you know, everybody says middle age is not a good thing, but actually in this case, middle-aged trees are good. What is a middle-aged tree? Well, it depends, right? You're probably in your 30s to 40s, maybe 50s for some trees. It just depends on the species and how long they're going to survive. So as I said, dormant season flooding with colder air and colder water temperatures, that's better for trees. Flooding is no good no matter what, but that, at least if we're going to have them, that is a better condition to have. So this makes sense, of course, too, if you're thinking about when a plant is just starting to grow in the spring and then kind of shutting down in the fall, these are not the best times for a lot of changes to happen with the root system and the stems of the plant. So it sets everything off balance that's already in kind of high action mode. So having foliage covered by water, certainly really a serious issue. So how do we prevent it, right? And I know you guys are probably hoping for me to give you the silver bullet, right? There are not any of those, as we know in urban forestry, that in most things that is certainly not the case where we can say this is the way to prevent these things. But there certainly are some ways to prevent these things. We need to think about how we are developing our communities. With this vast mass grading, we are certainly altering our soils to an extent that in our lifetimes, and certainly they're not going to be back to what they once were, no matter how much organic matter we might add to those systems. I show this tree on the right that was this went down in a microburst, which is kind of weird winds that spin in the opposite direction than normal. So it's nothing that we can control. But if you look at this root system, yes, we understand that the root systems are fairly shallow even on large mature trees. But if you look at this, you can see that the soil here was very poor quality soil, and it was heavily compacted on the top surface of the plant. So a top heavy tree with a lot of canopy growing in a fairly shallow, poor soil is certainly going to be more prone to failure than a tree that has been planted in good, well-prepared soil and has sufficient space to grow, right? We know there's some species that can grow in these really terrible, tough sites, right? That it's calorie pair. Of course, we don't want to plant them anymore, but they are really tough trees and they can grow in really difficult sites. These are Zelkova, and honestly, I don't know what you guys have been seeing out there, but I've been seeing a lot more issues with Zelkova in recent years where they don't seem to be quite as stress tolerant as we once thought. I see some really good ones, but then I see many, many more now that seem to be losing the interior part of their canopies and just not performing well over the long term. And I don't know the complete reason why that might be happening. Certainly making sure that we protect that really fragile area, in my mind, of the tree where it's transitioning from trunk wood into roots wood. Very sensitive part of the tree, very active part of the tree, and so we want to make sure that we are not putting soil over these, and that certainly we are planting trees correctly. I'll just tell you a really quick little story. We had a tree right out behind Kilgore Hall here at NC State, where our horticulture department is. It was about, I would say, a 15-year-old tree. It was maybe 8 to 10 inch diameter, and it died this summer. And of course, everybody was, Barb, why did this tree die? Because it did look like it up and died. There were actually 2 behind there that died that way. Well, we had the opportunity to bring in an air spade with the students and actually excavate a good portion around the root collar of the tree. And what we found is quite a large development of adventitious roots from original production. So it was planted too deeply in the root ball, we believe, when it was first installed. So therefore it was planted too deeply in the soil because it wasn't managed right when they didn't realize that, where they didn't see where those first main order roots were. And additionally, there were many, many trunk girdling roots. So our guess is this is predisposed this particular tree. Why did that tree die of all the other trees behind the building? Well, we think that is one of the things that predisposed this plant to actual death after, again, what I've mentioned about weather, this altering weather pattern that the tree has kind of been exposed to. So it really is important to plant trees correctly. You know, a lot of people say, well, what difference does it make? It doesn't happen for many years down the line. But this was a significant tree in the landscape. And if we're losing those, we're losing the great benefit that those trees are just really beginning to offer. So I want to show you just some information here that I researched from a variety of communities. And some are New York, some are New Jersey, some are not necessarily in the South. But what I wanted you to see is that it's really important to take note in your community what seems to do well over time. And if you were able to go to the annual urban forestry meeting and hear Kim Coder speak, he talked a lot about this and selecting a handful of species to try to grow and see how they do in the community over the long term. And these were just little case studies where people presented information to kind of say, these are the plants that we saw that did really well in our community and others that didn't. And you guys might be as surprised as I was by some of the ones that did not perform as well as I would have thought. So I love, of course, Celtis occidentalis is on there. That's one of my favorite trees. And everybody, why do you like hackberry? Because it's tough. It is a tough tree. So I'm not surprised in these flooding conditions that that Acer saccharinum did well. That's not too surprising. But for junipers to do better in these wetter conditions, and these are all based on after the flood. Okay, that's where these came from, after some of the major storms that we've had. So some of these aren't surprising. Are we going to plant a Morris species in our landscape, mulberry? Probably not, but at least it's something to think about that we might actually put in there. Most communities are not going to plant Populus deltoides, certainly, but I was surprised that there was a cherry on this list. I would not have put a cherry here in most cases. Taxodium and Thuya picata, so a little bit different than Thuya occidentalis, and certainly some of the elm species were on there, which again, not very surprised by. So what they found did not do as well. And Acer palmatum, I consider Acer palmatum, Japanese maple, one of our toughest trees. I think it does very well in our drought conditions. Now, certainly if you have the really fine cut ones, it's not going to maybe do well if we have a late frost and it's already leafed out, which often happens, right? We get that 2 weeks of 80-degree weather and then we get nailed. So that might not be the case, but I have found them to be very drought tolerant in many cases. So Leyland cypress, oh, there's a mark against it. That's not a bad thing at all, certainly. Way too many of those. But I was surprised to see tulip poplar on that list of trees that they found did not do very well under those circumstances. And so some of these maybe not quite as surprised by, but kind of give you an idea of what they're finding to work well and maybe not work as well. And so, you know, reading and talking to each other across communities, and I think this is something, if we can find a way to gather that kind of information, would be super helpful for us to decide what do we need to plant as we're moving forward, because it's not like the weather is going to change for us. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen this diagram from Jim Urban, just kind of showing you how much root volume do trees really need. And I think we cannot overstate how important it really is to mitigate, if nothing else, compaction on a site. That doesn't mean adding 30% by volume organic matter. It means adding a reasonable amount, which I think is closer to about 10% at the maximum, and then providing enough space. Can we provide good soil for plants? And I think a lot of it goes back to moving away from these designer soil ideas to just protecting the soil that we really have. I know that may not be all that straightforward or easy, but I think it's something to really try to move toward. Certainly protecting trees during any kind of construction that's happening. You can see these trees are not going to stand up for very much longer. Certainly they're not going to live. The trees at the bottom that show you that all 4 sides of those root systems were cut. This is criminal to me. I would like to see those people arrested and placed in the slammer, but that's just me. So we think about the Forest Service, of course, recommends that you have that for a 1.5-inch diameter tree, you should be about a foot away from the trunk. That doesn't always happen and cannot always happen, but there are different ways to accommodate this. That top tree, what could they have done instead of severing those roots? They could have gone in with an air spade or air knife and excavated the soil and put in whatever they needed to put in the piping underneath the tree roots. So really critical that we preserve these spaces. And nowadays you'll see a lot bigger fencing than this. I do, at least. Wooden fencing. I see a lot of 2x4s tied around the trunks of the trees as well. So anything we can do to protect that really sensitive area. We know this, but just kind of reminding ourselves. And if we don't plant trees correctly, I mentioned the girdling roots on the tree that died out back. Well, if they don't die that way in the long term, then they may die this way, where now they've become a safety hazard because those girdling roots will actually eventually lead to the failure of the entire tree. So really thinking about planting them correctly and not burying the root collars of these trees. Certainly, can you remove? I know I have heard Ed Gilman say it's not worth the time to try to fix the root system of a tree. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think if you take the time, you will have a much better tree in the long term. Not every nursery tree you buy is going to be absolutely perfect. So as I mentioned, root collar excavation can be a really important tool after the storm for those trees that we know need some significant work. You may need to do some staking of some of these trees. And I have certainly seen large trees be reset in the landscape that have fallen over if it's done fairly quickly, but it means heavy staking. And if you think about some of the ways we've taught you recently how to stake with the stakes going down in the soil and then 2x2s across the top, well, on large trees you may need to use 2x4s or something fairly substantial, again, to hold the root system of the tree down. Staking them the old traditional way with the webbing and the 3 ties outside the hole is probably not going to do it if a tree's been wind thrown. So you have to be a little bit more conscious of that. Again, this may sound simple, but if we don't plant enough trees, then we're not going to have enough trees to maintain our urban forests. And I say this because a lot of times after a storm comes through, what is the first thing that many folks want to do that don't know any better? They want to cut all of their trees down. So we certainly don't want to promote that. We do want them to plant new trees in those sites, but it is understandable people are afraid. They are worried about this tree failing and falling on their house. And so that's certainly a legitimate concern. But we also don't want them to take down every tree in their landscape that may not be a hazard. And if it withstood a storm, that's a pretty good tree to kind of keep in your landscape. One of the other things we don't always think about is making sure that we have infiltrative landscapes. How do we decrease the amount of hardscapes? That's not just good for our communities and our stormwater issues, but if we're having all of this flooding, where does the water go if we've created these communities that are primarily hardscape? So there are so many examples out there. If you've ever been to Portland, Oregon, they have an awesome management plan for their stormwater. Granted, it does not rain in the same level and the same intensity as it does here, but that means we need to be even more vigilant about how we create our landscapes and how we develop these places that water will actually infiltrate. So a couple of other things to kind of think about is planting trees. Let's plant them away from structures so that people don't have to be worried that a tree is going to fall on their property at night or after the storm. And it is very difficult to predict when a tree may fail after a storm has come through. It may seem perfectly fine for a while, and then you may find out that you start losing leaves and you start losing canopy, and it may be time to actually do a removal. If you can't remove you can move the target. Is there a way to restrict use in a certain area? And that might be very appropriate along greenways and things like that, where we really need to preserve the trees, particularly along riparian corridors. You guys have heard me talk. If you've heard me talk before, this is my soapbox and will continue to be my soapbox, that we do need to really train young trees. I hear communities and campus say they don't have the staff. They need to get the staff, or they need to train volunteers to do this work. This, to me, is the primary way to mitigate storm damage in the future. There has been a lot of work done, particularly with ice storms, snow loads, and things like that, looking at well-trained, healthy trees are much less prone to damage and failure than trees that have not been pruned. That is information that's out there, and it is really important in how we develop a proactive approach to our urban forestry care rather than a reactive approach. And that's what most of us do. And if we are not training young trees, then we are not being proactive. And it really is not that costly. And oftentimes I'll recommend to communities when they go do a big planting project or they hire a company to do that for them, then part of the specifications need to be, if you see a codominant leader or some structural issue, prune it right at planting, then you don't have to worry about coming back in another few years to do it. And I know the city of Columbus in Ohio had that program, and they were really quite successful. And they didn't have any more budget or any more people than any other community, but they were really, that was really important for them to get those programs off the ground. So it's possible certainly to install support systems, cabling and bracing if there are significant trees that do have structural issues that we haven't been able to prevent ahead of time. Certainly lightning protection, and lots of really great tree care companies out there that do this work. It isn't inexpensive, but it certainly can be really helpful. And I know Tom Smiley's done quite a bit of work on different cabling and bracing techniques out there. I don't know if he's actually published that or not, but certainly Bartlett might be a place to go to check out some of that information. So certainly Growth regulators. A lot of people don't like growth regulators, but growth regulators are a tool that we have kind of in our toolbox to say this is one way to help manage the growth rate of trees, particularly under utility lines. And there's tons of information out there and research that's been done on how how actually growth regulators can help trees during a drought. They actually have been found they produce smaller leaves. The leaves are thicker and greener, and so actually they are much more water stress tolerant than they would have been without the growth regulators. So there is a lot of research that's been done on that, and so growth regulators have also been found to be helpful in fighting off or kind of mitigating the effects of some fungal and bacterial caused diseases. So the trees most likely to have issues, as you might expect, are more mature trees that maybe have not been well maintained or were not pruned when they were young, certainly again. Codominant stems, that's a big one with bark inclusions. Those branches are probably going to fail no matter what, but if you're going to have a storm, and I can tell you right now that what I mentioned about that microburst, there were trees on campus that had each of these issues, and they were lost during that microburst. They would have been lost no matter what, but that was a pretty serious issue, and we lost many trees on that day because of those concerns. So cracks, certainly any crack you see, it to me is a tree already failing, so we certainly need to think about that. We don't always know for sure if there's a root or root decay until we start seeing some of those fruiting bodies. Certainly be on the watch for particularly willow oak in that 80-year-old range. You're going to see something called weeping conch. Weeping conch has been, most of these fungal diseases have been working in the plant for many years before you actually see the fruiting body. And so once you see that fruiting body, particularly of the weeping conch, that means that tree is ready to be taken out. It should have been taken out before, but once you see that, that is the time to remove that plant for sure. And it does seem to affect willow oak very extensively. And so, yeah, you're at that 80-year-old range, and that's something to really be watching out for. Large branches that are kind of overextended, maybe there's a lot of pressure on that branch collar, that kind of focal point. So looking at branches that have maybe some poor taper, that the length to diameter ratio is a little bit more than 100 to 1. So kind of keeping in mind, again, these are all structural things that hopefully could be prevented with a good management program. Looking at those old pruning wounds, and again, if there are bad wounds because you've had large branches that have been lost in a storm and you've had to take them off or clean them off at the collar, again, keep in mind those branches that are not going to close, those wounds that don't close over, allow a lot of oxygen into the tree. And I've already mentioned how damaging that can actually be and how you can end up with decay inside a plant. And certainly with those big openings, that's a great entry point for fungal organisms as well. So kind of looking again at what do the branches look like, how far do they extend beyond the canopy. So here are trees that, again, you can see should have been pruned when they were younger. Some of these upright vase-shaped forms, they're a little bit more challenging for somebody to prune. You really need somebody that has the knowledge of pruning to be able to remove these branches correctly, because this form, it's just not as easy as elevating a limb. Right, so that tree, I'm guessing it's on your left with the big crack, that is certainly a tree that's already failing and needs to be removed. The tree on the right is actually a calorie pear, and it's a big one, but it's not surprising that it looks that way, right? Because that's often how they grow together. And so that tree is still very healthy, could last for a while, but certainly something that we would really need to be concerned about falling apart. So it's pretty straightforward. This tree on the right, this was, if you can see, you'll see there was originally 2 codominant limbs where they failed there. So a total of 4 main leaders on this tree. And if you look, you can see where one of the wounds had started, has a little bit of wound wood forming around it, and that one failed a while ago because of a bark inclusion. And you can see where it failed again this time. And these are not small branches. And you can see keep in mind, The reason this is so significant is a branch is attached to a tree over time. Every year, as the tree trunk lays down wood, it lays down wood around that branch as well. With codominant stems, each of those forms separately. They are not attached to one another as an individual tree. They are all each separate in a sense, separate stems. So that is why it is so easy for them to actually fall apart. Can't stress enough regular inspections, being out there and looking at what you have in the community. This is a yellowwood that went down during that same microburst. Part of it did. What's interesting, if you can't really see here, maybe very well, but right above the yellow tape on that tree are adventitious roots forming inside where that codominant stem was, because there was a lot of soil and organic matter that accumulated there. So roots formed there. They're going to form wherever they can find a good stuff to grow with. So taking out whatever needs to be taken out, and again, being proactive. The cost is much, much higher if you're operating under a crisis than if you're operating under a performed schedule. So we know this. We just don't always seem to pay enough attention to make sure we actually get out there. Oh, I'm glad I had a close-up of that. Isn't that cool, though? How trees actually can do crazy growth like that. I love trees. They're pretty amazing, aren't they? And you can see the yellow wood of that yellow wood. Yellow wood is a really great native tree, but it does tend to have fairly weak wood, and it does tend to grow like that with multiple stems. So something, if you're going to plant, you want to be a little bit more cautious of. Sadly, this was, I believe, a chinkapin oak at the State Troopers Training School on Garner Road. It's right up the street from my house, so I was able to go take pictures when this branch failed. And again, you can see why that failed. There's a lot of other issues with this tree as well, but these are beautiful. There's a number of them there, beautiful, amazing trees that we really have to think about. How do we manage these well? And I know the Forest Service, actually, I think the State Forest Service has helped them work on managing those trees. So it's great to have that resource in the state. So if you are doing crisis management, it is more likely that you could have certain issues, certainly. And you know, in a litigious society as we live in, that can certainly lead to big expenses for communities. So proactive risk management, as I said, certainly includes proper pruning. And if you're doing it on a budget and you're making sure that you're taking care of the overall health of your tree canopy, it will be a long-term success, I believe. So, you know, we love planting trees, right? Planting trees is kind of the sexy part of urban forestry, but maintaining trees is really the key. If we don't have the means to maintain them, should we really be planting them? And that's a legitimate question to kind of think about. As I mentioned before, just as an example, and this is from way back in 1998, but after that ice storm, what they found is those trees that were well maintained and well pruned were far less likely to have branch damage on them. And 84% of the damaged trees had some defect. That's pretty significant and could have been avoided with proper pruning. So what do we tell the public, right? Because they, number one, they may be afraid. And of course they have, after a storm, you have people that, to me, again, kind of criminal activity. People drive around and say, hey, I can take this tree down for you for, you know, this really cheap price. And that's what ends up happening, is a lot of trees are lost when they shouldn't be taken down, when they're perfectly fine. But out of that fear, people want to have the trees removed. And there's a guy right there saying, hey, I can do this for you for this really great price. So we know we have to hire people that know what they're doing and do have some sort of liability insurance or are bonded in some way, and always telling them to ask for references, you know, find out if these people are really good or not, because there certainly are still plenty of folks out there that may well not know what they're doing. And so I threw kind of this idea of the trunk decay in here, because I want you to remember that a lot of time the layperson isn't going to see these things. They may not understand what's happening inside their tree. And so we know that, and sometimes we can't see it. This was a linden that was on State's campus, and there was actually no, and it's not the same trunk on the right actually for that tree, but we know that there was no outward evidence on this tree of that internal decay. So that's kind of scary, but keeping in mind that how important regular inspections are and looking for things as much as possible. So a lot of folks have a lot of different cool tools out there. Some communities have invested in these. These are not necessarily inexpensive. The resistograph, of course, that's the one in the top picture where you are actually drilling a little hole in the tree, keeping in mind that the bits aren't that long that they're going to be able to go all the way through. So you're going to have to make a few assessments throughout the trunk of the tree as well. Some of these sonic assessments, this tomography, those are actually quite expensive. But certainly can help tell you what's going on inside the tree in a little bit more complete way than the resistograph might be able to do. And certainly root collar excavations are really important, especially if you think there may be some root rot issues. So to kind of wrap it all up, certainly this is nothing that we don't know already, that we really have the means to help kind of care for our trees and plant good trees before the storm comes. They're always going to come. We're not always going to be able to manage trees without damage. That's always going to happen because powers of wind and rain are pretty strong. So doing the best we can with putting the right plants in the right place and seeing what does work, what survives after the storm, kind of just watching what's happening in your community and talking to fellow urban foresters in other communities to see what really is working and what's not working, and what can we learn from each other is really important. And so certainly planting properly, pruning properly, doing those assessments, that's all really important, and making sure we do plant trees in those coastal areas, but know what we're doing and know how to install them correctly. So really, just a really common sense approach, but sometimes we don't always do things in a very common sense way, do we? So we do have the means to have beautiful communities like this, I still believe, and look at the size of those tree lawns there and those big, beautiful trees. So thank you guys for your time today. I really appreciate it. And that's my information. You're always welcome to email me or to call me. That's my cell number, and those are both the best ways to get a hold of me. So I appreciate your time today, and we got plenty of time for questions, it looks like.
Thank you. So there's Barb's email address and phone number. You can always reach out to her if you need more specifications on some of the stuff. I am going to, let me put up my presentation real quick. So now is the way for a chance for everybody to do a question answer period. If you've got some questions, you'll need to put them into the chat dialog box. Just type it in there to give Barb a chance to respond and answer anything. It's a good opportunity to pick her brain on some of these things if there are specifics that you need for your storm preparation or storm recovery. If you've got trees that you're concerned about, or if your community doesn't have a storm preparation plan or recovery plan, then now might be a time to start considering that. One thing I do want to point out throughout Barb's presentation is it talks about proactive management. I do agree with her, and I think the tree care industry as a whole agrees that actually having proactive management within your community or your neighborhood is a great way to get a jump on any storm damage. So it's just something to consider trying to move forward with. So I'll give everybody a couple minutes to type in any questions in the chat box, and I'll bring them to Barb's attention. In the meantime, we've got here is the ISA certification code. So we did qualify for 1 credit hour of certified arborist credit. So you need to write down that code, and then you do a self documentation where you submit it to ISA, and it'll get attached to your account.
Leslie, can I interject a little bit of advertisement here?
Yeah, by all means.
Okay, so some of you may have gotten a save the date card and may not have. You can certainly go to the Urban Forestry Council website for more information. We are holding a joint conference between the Urban Forestry Council and NC State Extension. It's called Trees and the Law, and it's navigating the complexities of neighbor law. And so it's lined up to be a really great program, and that's February 13th, 2020. So look for registration to be coming up pretty soon on the website. We hope to see you guys there. If you have any issues with trees and legalities, that's the place to come and learn about how to maybe avoid getting into trouble, so to speak. So I just wanted to put a shout out to that because we're really excited about it. It's been a great partnership so far, and Leslie's been terrific in helping me negotiate things that I have not had to do with conferences before. So we hope you guys will have an opportunity to attend.
Yeah, this is probably a really good um, platform or topic to mention that at, because there are a lot of legal issues as far as liability and who's responsible for what if a tree does fail, and we will have um, folks there from the legal world that might be able to address some of those questions and concerns. Um, But so yeah, you can go to our website to get more information about that. I'm not getting any questions so far on anything. So Barb, I'm thinking that means you did an excellent job on covering this. I will say that one of the topics that we are planning to cover in 2020. So here are our dates for our 2020 webinars. I'm still working out uh, the topics. So if you have a specific topic you want to make sure I address, you can always email me directly. But one of the topics that I know we are considering, I'm just trying to line up the speakers, is trying to do have someone or a couple people on here that talk about volunteer training, using volunteers to do young tree training. There are a couple of programs called uh, that a couple municipalities in North Carolina, as well as in some neighboring states, have had a lot of success using volunteers, whether they're tree board volunteers or different community groups or neighborhood like HOAs, and having like tree tenders that can go out and help with some of that stuff and take the workload off. So that's just something to keep an eye out for. So here are the dates. Go ahead and mark your calendars. We'll be sending out some save the date information probably closer to after Christmas, the beginning part of 2020. Um, and could maybe address some of your needs here for community forestry or tree board uh, needs in that way. But I did have somebody ask a question about how to get the certification code. So this code here, PA-19-785, you just need to write that down, and there's a form on the ISA's website. And if you need that that form, let me know. Send me an email. My email is here at the bottom, and I can get that out to you. But it's a self-reporting form, so you would just write down the workshop title, this code, and then put your information on it, and then you mail it to ISA directly, and it gets applied to your account that way.